looking at the big picture, you would agree that China's growing expansionism and hegemonic designs are something that are causing alarm in many parts of the world, including India and the US. These countries have repeatedly expressed grave concern, and we've seen multiple manifestations of this expansionism and hegemony, as it were. Apart from the domestic political bickering that this New York Times story has triggered here in India, what kind of reactions, I'm curious, has it evoked in the United States? Has it caused as much concern there as it has here in India?
Of course, this is a big story here as well, Neha. But we must first understand, why does China even need someone like a Neville Roy Singham? China's need for someone like that arises from its state of desperation at the moment. As we know, the whole world is now moving away from China towards other countries like India for very simple reasons. China hasn't played the world game fair and square. US in particular, where there's a huge anti-China sentiment, whether it is in the local people, the Americans, or the administration, are really unhappy about the fact that for years, China has stolen a lot of IP from America and gone on to build its own companies without any regard for patents, rights, or any royalty or any such thing. So that is something which hasn't gone down well with the American administration, which has finally woken up to the fact that it has given a free ride to China all these years. So there is a huge anti-China sentiment which is prevailing in the US right now, whether it's at the administration or even at the down to the masses. So that is something China desperately needs to counter. It needs to come across as a country which has done no wrong, that it's a friendly country, that its growth is purely because of the hard work and the planning that the government has done over the years. So that's the narrative that China wants to build. And that narrative can only come from people like Neville Roy Singham, who are sympathetic to China, if not on the payrolls of China, which he has denied, although there are many factors and evidences which suggest that he is quite close to the Chinese Communist government.
All right, plenty of indications there that he is close to the government. Has he been doing the bidding for the Communist Party of China? That remains the big question, and surely this is a story that's going to continue to generate a heated debate, I guess, especially here in India. Stay on with us, Sri. We're coming back to you in just a moment. Moving on to our second big story of the day. Now, days after his indictment for efforts to overturn the 2020 presidential election, an appearance in a Washington court, former US President and 2024 presidential hopeful Donald Trump seems to be using every trick in the book to delay his trial in the unprecedented case. Taking to his Truth Social platform, Trump launched a scathing attack on the American Capitol, describing it as a filthy and crime-ridden embarrassment. Facing a federal trial on conspiracy and obstruction charges, while also being the prime Republican contender for the White House ahead of the 2024 elections, Trump is evidently trying to have the trial moved to a more politically favorable location. In his all-capital letters post, Trump wrote, and I quote, "No way can I get a fair trial or even close to a fair trial in Washington, D.C." He argued that such a move would be unpopular with potential jurors. Not only that, Trump has announced his intention to seek the recusal of Judge Tanya Chutkan on grounds which he claims are very powerful, even though he has provided no evidence whatsoever to support this claim. Judge Tanya was appointed by former President Barack Obama, a Democrat. Now, the indictment against Trump that was handed down in Washington last week accuses him of knowingly spreading falsehoods about the 2020 election being rigged, aiming to undermine faith in the voting process and retain power. Besides this trial, he faces separate criminal prosecutions in New York and Florida, and there are potential charges pending in Georgia, all while he continues with his presidential campaign. Meanwhile, former Republican Vice President Mike Pence, who is now Trump's rival in the 2024 race, has not ruled out the possibility of becoming a prosecution witness in the trial against his former boss. Interestingly, Trump, who has been indicted thrice already in multiple cases, has also boasted We need one more indictment to close out this election. Nobody even stands a chance. As we said, Trump continues to be the Republican frontrunner for the White House, and some might argue that the indictments have indeed helped his popularity with his core support base grow further.
Fake charges put forth by the Biden sham, we call it a sham indictment, and the man that's doing it, I really believe he's mentally ill. But these are outrageous, and it is an outrageous criminalization of political speech. They're trying to make it illegal to question the results of an election. But you don't have strong borders and you don't have good elections, you really don't have a country. So they rigged the presidential election of 2020, and we're not going to allow them to rig the presidential election of 2024 because our country's not going to survive. Joe Biden is the most incompetent and corrupt president in United States history. The Biden crime family was taking in money from China, Ukraine, Russia, and many, many other countries. And now, whenever more Biden corruption is exposed, his henchmen charge me with crimes.
All right, Sri, coming back to you at this point. Take the case out of Washington, D.C. I'm not going to get a fair trial. Change the judge. Some would say Trump is just being Trump and using every trick in the book to delay the trial. His focus obviously being on the presidential election campaign. But, he's gone as far as to say that Judge Tanya Chutkan will not be able to give him a fair trial, and he has quote-unquote very powerful grounds to seek her recusal, even though he has produced no evidence to back his claim. What is Trump so afraid of? The fact that Judge Tanya Chutkan was appointed by Barack Obama, a Democrat, or the fact that she's been rather tough on Capitol Hill rioters?
Well, that would be a fair summary of Mr. Trump's own fears about the judge and the location of the case. But Neha, the point is the judge is a fair judge, and when they look at a case, they look at all the available evidence. So the two things that Mr. Trump is asking for, which is that the case should be moved out of Washington, D.C. to West Virginia, is not going to happen because the law on that issue is fairly well settled. The law and the Constitution very clearly says that the trial must happen in the place where the alleged crime was committed. And in this case, this is Washington, D.C. So the trial will be held in D.C. unless there is some exceptional reason that the Trump lawyers are able to come up with. But right now, we can't see any exceptional reason why they'll be granted that sort of a privilege. Number two, Mr. Trump has also asked that the judge, Tanya Chutkan, recuse herself. Again, that's based on his fear that she may not be fair. But there is nothing, again, which suggests that the judge is not going to be fair. So I don't think either of the two things, either shifting the case out of D.C. or recusing the judge, is going to happen. And Mr. Trump will have to go with what is a well laid out judicial process in the United States. Unfortunately, he has to follow that and see what the outcome is.
All right. Shri, I have a lot of Trump questions for you, but because we have limited time on the show, I'm going to fire these quick couple of questions at you before we move on to the next story. Number one, there are those who actually believe now that Trump may well be running for the White House again, essentially to escape prison. Is that an assessment you share? Number one. Number two, many have also pointed out that the deeper Trump gets into legal troubles, the more popular he seems to actually become with his core support base. Do you think that is the case even now with this latest indictment?
Two very interesting questions that you asked, Neha. One, of course, well, I can't speak for Mr. Trump, but the fact is he is running for the 2024 presidential election, and he is the Republican frontrunner by far. I mean, he's more popular than most leaders right now, Republican leaders in the United States. So he's the number one candidate as far as the Republican Party is concerned. Number two, whether he's running for the presidential office so that he can stay out of prison, well, that would only happen if he becomes the president and he's able to pardon himself. Now, there is no constitutional precedence where a president has actually conducted a pardon of his own crimes. It's evident that whatever would be the precedent, it's a gray area, but the fact remains that Constitution or the Supreme Court here will not look kindly on any president who pardons himself his own crime. So you can't be the committer of the crime and also your own judge. So that principle law will get violated, and that is why even if Mr. Trump tries to pardon himself, once if he becomes a president, it will definitely go to the Supreme Court, and the pardon will be tested there. The presidential power to pardon himself will be tested at the Supreme Court. That is number one. The other thing, how are people looking at it? I mean, he's by far the most popular front runner. And the other question that you wanted to ask me was about, just remind me again, what was it about?
Whether you believe that his popularity has only soared since his third indictment.
Absolutely. So what we have seen is that when Mr. Trump said he needs one more indictment to be by far the presidential candidate of choice, he wasn't joking. So every time there is a new case or an indictment brought against Mr. Trump, his funding actually goes up. So with every indictment, there's more money that's coming in to support him. So Mr. Trump, in some sense, is very, very popular with his voter base. And we do see him becoming more powerful as the government, as the federal agencies put new cases or bring indictment against him. He is becoming more popular and stronger as a presidential candidate.
Becoming more popular and stronger, and Trump being Trump, who knows, he may very well get elected to the White House, and if he does get convicted later, he is quite capable, as we know, of pardoning himself. Though, of course, it has been pointed out that that could very well trigger a constitutional crisis in the United States, which does not have a precedent for this kind of a situation. All right, Sri, let's now turn our attention to the Russia-Ukraine war. In the latest escalation between Russia and Ukraine, on Monday, explosions hit critical road bridges linking occupied Crimea with parts of Kherson region under Russian control. It is being seen as Ukraine's escalation in its targeting of Russian infrastructure and territory. The blasts came on the same day when the Moscow mayor said a drone had been shot down approaching the city, and soon after, Ukraine struck one of Russia's biggest oil tankers with a sea drone, carried out an attack on a major naval base. Acting Kherson Regional Governor Vladimir Saldo, a Moscow appointee, claimed the strike on one of the three road links between Crimea and mainland Ukraine involved an Anglo-French Storm Shadow missile, though he offered no evidence. Ukraine had struck the same bridge in June. Saldo also said that Ukrainian shelling damaged a village school and a gas pipeline running alongside a bridge, leaving more than 20,000 people without gas. The attacks are making it increasingly hard to get on and off the Crimean Peninsula, which Russia seized from Ukraine in 2014 and which is of military significance to Moscow as well as a popular tourist destination for Russians. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Zelensky has said that Ukraine has shot down a significant part of Moscow's attacks over the past week, which included 65 missiles of various kinds and 178 assault drones, including 87 Shaheeds, despite waves of Russian airstrikes that Kiev says targeted residential buildings and civilians, leaving some dead. Also, in a related development, Saudi Arabia hosted talks on the conflict in Ukraine over the weekend. Some 40 countries, including India, China and the United States, represented by their national security advisors, attended the talks in Jeddah. Significantly, Russia was not invited to these talks. Diplomats said the Ukraine organized meetings were intended to engage a range of countries in debates about a path towards peace, notably members of the BRICS bloc that have adopted a somewhat neutral stance on the war in contrast to Western powers. Senior officials from these 40 countries try to carve a path towards an agreement on key principles for a peaceful end to Russia's war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Zelensky wants the talks to lead to a peace summit of global leaders, which he has hinted might in fact take place in autumn. Saudi Arabia, the world's biggest crude exporter, which works closely with Moscow on oil policy, has touted its ties to both sides and positioned itself as a possible mediator in the war. In May this year, the kingdom hosted Zelensky at an Arab summit. Zelensky had then accused some world leaders of turning a blind eye to the horrors of Russia's invasion. Meanwhile, Moscow has called the Jeddah meeting a doomed attempt to swing the global south behind Kiev. Let's go back to Sri and get his perspective from Washington on this story. Again, 2 points here, Sri. Number one, do you see the attacks on the Crimean bridge as a significant escalation between Russia and Ukraine? Because it seems to be a particularly sensitive issue for the Kremlin, you would agree. And two, what more can you tell us about the significance of the Jeddah talks and whether any headway has been made?
Right. So the attack on the bridges, the two bridges in Crimea, were indeed unfortunate, coming as they did at a time when Ukraine itself had invited Saudi Arabia to host an event where 40 countries would come together and discuss the 10 principles on which the country wants to stitch a peace proposal together. So the least one would expect is for these countries to first get into some sort of a ceasefire negotiation before they actually start talking an ambitious peace project. So in that sense, Neha, it leads me to the second question, like what do I make of the meeting that happened in Jeddah? What was the outcome? Well, the Ukraine has the Ukraine counterpart, they've described it as productive. Russia has completely trashed it, saying it's a doomed kind of a meeting, simply because they were not invited. And I don't think Russia would have, at this stage, gone into a meeting without some basic principles being settled. For example, Russia wants the territories which are now considered part of its constitution, the Ukraine territories which are part of Russia now, as envisaged in the constitution, to remain with Russia. So unless these big elephants in the room are dealt with first, I don't think there is going to be any real progress made as far as peace negotiations and any kind of a peace proposal can come to fruition, Neha.
Yes, and certainly going by the transitions of the two sides, it would seem like neither of them really wants to give peace a chance at this point in time.